My dad pushed my 9-year-old daughter to the floor at Christmas and said, "That seat is for my real grandkid." The room went dead quiet. Then my mother looked at me like, "Please don't." I reached into my purse anyway because I'd found something 2 weeks earlier that changed who they were. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I need you to stay with me through this because what happened didn't start at the table. It started years earlier in small rooms and quiet decisions, and the kind of silence that teaches you where you rank before anyone ever says it out loud. So let me rewind to the kind of childhood that looks normal in photos but feels wrong in your bones. The kind where you learn early that love is conditional and belonging has rules you didn't agree to, but are punished for breaking anyway. I grew up in the same house I walked into that Christmas Eve, same dining room, same table, same chair hierarchy that somehow everyone understood without ever discussing. The head seat belonged to my father, the right side belonged to my sister Chelsea, the left side rotated depending on who was useful that year, and then there were the other seats, the filler seats, the ones you're allowed to occupy as long as you don't forget your place. I learned my place early. I was the quiet one, the helpful one, the one who didn't need things because needing things made my father irritated, and irritation in that house was dangerous. Chelsea was different. Chelsea was adored, not because she was kinder or smarter or more responsible, but because she reflected back the version of my father he liked believing in. She laughed at his jokes, agreed with his opinions, never challenged his authority, and when she did something wrong it was charming. When I did the same thing it was disrespect. That pattern didn't disappear when we became adults. It just got dressed up in nicer language and holiday decor. When I became a single mother it wasn't treated like life happened. It was treated like a personal failure that embarrassed the family brand. No one said those exact words. They didn't have to. They said things like, "That's unfortunate," and, "Well, choices matter," and "Kids need stability." While handing Chelsea praise for buying throw pillows and calling it design, my daughter Maisie was born into that atmosphere. She's 9 now, old enough to notice when smiles are fake and old enough to feel the difference between being tolerated and being wanted. She never complained. That's the part that still hurts the most. She learned to shrink without being told. She learned to watch adults' faces before speaking. She learned that excitement should be muted and questions should be saved for later, because later sometimes means never. Christmas Eve was supposed to be safe. That's what I told myself. That's what I told her. We drove there with wrapped gifts sliding on the back seat and holiday music playing too loud because silence in the car makes room for thoughts you don't want to have. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon, and that sharp undertone of tension families pretend is tradition. Chelsea was already there when we arrived. Of course she was. She always arrives early because early arrivals get the best positioning. Her daughter Poppy was already seated near my father, perched in that special chair like it had been reserved in her name before she could spell it. Maisie noticed immediately. I saw it in the way her eyes tracked the room and then flicked back to me for reassurance. I squeezed her hand, a small eye wrapped in a gesture. "It's okay, we're okay." My father made one of his comments when we walked in, something about timing, something about how nice it was that we made it this time. I smiled because that's what I've always done when he aims those little darts. Smile, absorb, move on. Dinner started like it always does. Jokes that land sideways. Laughter that feels obligatory. Stories that elevate Chelsea while erasing anyone else's contributions. Maisie sat quietly beside me, swinging her legs just above the floor, waiting for the moment when she was supposed to stand and find her seat, because Chelsea had made place cards this year, glittered ones, carefully arranged. And when Maisie saw her name, she smiled in that hopeful way kids do before they learn hope is risky. She picked up her card and stood, and this is where everything that had been building for decades finally broke the surface, because as she approached the table my father's expression changed, not surprised, not confused, but offended, like someone had violated an unspoken rule, and before I could move or speak or intercept, he said it, loud enough to cut through the room. "That seat is for my real grandkid." And then he pushed her, not hard enough to bruise an adult, but hard enough to knock a child off balance, hard enough to make her fall, hard enough to tell her exactly where she stood. Her knee hit the floor, and the sound of it still lives in my chest. What followed was worse than the shove. It was the silence, no gasps, no outrage, no one standing up, Just adults frozen in place. Like this was uncomfortable, but not unacceptable, like they were waiting to see how it would play out before choosing a side. I moved. Instinct took over. I was at her side in seconds, lifting her, checking her knee, whispering that she was okay even as my own hands shook. I looked around the table and saw nothing change in their faces. No apology forming, no regret dawning, just discomfort that the moment hadn't passed quickly enough. And that's when something inside me clicked into place. Not anger, not shock, clarity, the kind that feels cold and steady and final. Because I realized this wasn't an accident or a bad joke or a misunderstanding. This was the truth. Finally said out loud, my daughter clung to me, her fingers digging into my sleeve, and she asked in a voice so small it barely existed, "Is it because I'm not real?" And if you've ever felt your heart split clean in two, you know exactly what that moment did to me. I told her no. I told her she was real and loved and safe. And then I did something I'd never done in that house before. I stopped trying to keep the peace. I reached into my bag, the same bag I'd packed diapers into years earlier, the same bag I'd carried to family events like armor, and I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying for weeks, the one I kept telling myself I wouldn't need, the one I hoped I wouldn't have to use. I set it on the table, right in front of my father and mother, and I said the 4 words that changed the temperature of the room instantly. "You've been served." My mother's wine glass slipped from her hand. My father went pale in a way I'd never seen before. Not angry pale, not performative pale, but the kind of pale that comes when someone realizes the story they've been telling themselves is about to be rewritten by force. And I want you to stay with me, because what was inside that folder didn't just threaten them, it exposed years of choices, secrets, and a lie they thought they buried forever. And before I tell you how that folder came to exist and why I was ready, I want to pause right here and ask you something, not because it helps the algorithm, but because it helps me understand who's sitting on the other side of this story with me. Where are you watching from right now? What part of the world? What kind of home? Because stories like this land differently depending on where you're standing. Now let me keep going, because leaving that house that night felt different than every other time I'd left it. I wasn't retreating. I wasn't swallowing anything. I was done negotiating my worth. Maisie was quiet in the car, the kind of quiet that tells you a child is processing something too big for their age. I pulled over halfway home just to look at her and tell her again that she belonged, that no one gets to decide her realness. And as I drove the rest of the way, I kept thinking about how close I'd come to waiting too long, how easy it would have been to tell myself to deal with it after the holidays, after one more dinner, after one more apology that would never come. And if you're feeling that knot in your stomach right now, the one that says this sounds familiar, stay with me, because the next part isn't about revenge. It's about preparation and what happens when the people who underestimated you finally realize you were paying attention the whole time. I need to take you back a little further now, because what I did at that table didn't come from bravery in the moment. It came from weeks of quiet noticing, the kind you do when you've spent a lifetime being underestimated, and you finally stop wasting that skill. Because here's the truth people don't like hearing. The ones who hurt you the most often do it casually, comfortably, because they assume you'll never connect the dots. They assume silence means ignorance. They assume kindness means weakness. And my family assumed all of that about me for years. After my grandfather died, the house changed in a way no one talked about, but everyone felt. Conversations stopped including me. Decisions were announced instead of discussed. Money was mentioned like a myth instead of a fact. And anytime I asked a question, it was framed like I was being inappropriate for even wondering. My mother had a way of saying, there isn't anything set aside, that sounded so final, so reasonable, like a filing cabinet had been checked and closed. And I believed her, because believing her hurt less than believing she could lie to my face with that level of calm. I told myself inheritance wasn't something you expect, that family isn't transactional, that wanting clarity made me greedy. And those thoughts kept me compliant, which is exactly what they were designed to do. Fast forward to 2 weeks before Christmas, when Chelsea asked me to babysit Poppy, and I want you to notice this detail because it matters. She didn't ask our parents, she asked me, because I'm reliable, because I'm useful, because I say yes even when I shouldn't, and I told myself it was fine, it was just an hour. Poppy likes me. Maisie would enjoy playing with her cousin. Nothing about that day felt dangerous until the laptop opened, and I need you to understand, I didn't go looking for anything, I wasn't snooping, I wasn't suspicious. I was standing in the living room when Poppy flipped it open like it was normal. like it was familiar, and that alone made my stomach drop because kids don't know passwords unless they've watched someone type them over and over. The screen loaded and there it was, a document with my grandfather's name at the top, not hidden, not locked, just sitting there like it didn't matter who saw it, and something in my body went still, not panicked, focused. I sat down slowly and skimmed the way you skim when you're afraid of confirmation but more afraid of pretending you didn't see. My name was there, not a nickname, not a maybe, my full legal name, and below it numbers that didn't match the story I'd been told for years. Dates that lined up too cleanly with moments when Chelsea's life suddenly got easier and mine didn't. Moments when I was told there was nothing available while she announced something new, something upgraded, something blessed. I didn't cry, I didn't confront anyone. I took one photo and closed the laptop, because growing up the way I did teaches you one critical survival skill. You never reveal what you know until you know what it means. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was excited, but because the narrative I'd built my entire adulthood on had cracked. And once it cracks, you can't unsee the shape of it. 2 days later, I was sitting across from a lawyer named Rebecca Shaw, and I remember noticing how calm her office felt. Like the walls had heard worse stories and survived them. I slid my phone across the desk, and she didn't gasp or lean back or perform shock. She looked at it for seconds and said something that rewired my brain. If your name is on it, they don't get to decide you don't count. That sentence landed harder than any insult my father ever threw at me, because it reframed everything. Suddenly I wasn't dramatic or sensitive or entitled. I was documented. Rebecca explained what trustees are legally obligated to do, how intent works, how paper matters more than family mythology, and I left her office with a folder that felt heavier than its weight, because it represented something I'd never had before: leverage. For days I carried it without opening it, told myself I'd wait, told myself Christmas wasn't the time, told myself Maisie deserved one normal holiday, and I almost listened to those thoughts, almost let the pattern repeat, until my father shoved my child and called her unreal, and in that moment every excuse evaporated, because protecting peace stops being noble when it costs your kid their sense of belonging. Leaving that house felt like crossing a line I could never uncross, and the phone call started immediately. Chelsea first, sharp and panicked, my mother next, crying without apologizing, my father last, cold and threatening. And here's something important. None of them asked if Maisie was okay. Not once, not even performatively. Their fear wasn't about her, it was about exposure. Because they knew what that folder meant even if they didn't know how much I knew. That night at home, I iced Maisie's knee and made hot cocoa with too many marshmallows, because parenting sometimes means counteracting cruelty with sugar and warmth. She asked me in a small voice if she had done something wrong, and I told her no, and I meant it with a certainty I'd never felt before, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't negotiating truth. The next morning, the messages shifted from panic to narrative control. Vague posts about betrayal, about money tearing families apart, about people who ruin holidays, and I watched it with a strange calm, because I finally understood the playbook. When accountability approaches, they change the subject. When facts surface, they attack character. And when power slips, they reach for the oldest weapon they have: shame. My father sent a message that made my hands shake, not because it scared me, but because it revealed how far he was willing to go. He suggested court would be ugly, that questions might be asked about my legitimacy, about blood, about whether I even belonged in the family, and I stared at that text while Maisie slept on the couch, and something inside me hardened, because threatening a child's security to maintain control isn't protection, it's abuse dressed up as tradition. I called Rebecca and read her the message, and she laughed, not cruelly, knowingly. She said, "Desperate people throw sand." And then she told me something that gave me more peace than any reassurance ever had. The court doesn't care about their feelings, it cares about signatures. Hearings moved fast after that, emergency freezes, orders for records, deadlines that forced truth into daylight. My parents' lawyer tried to frame it as family misunderstanding, as intent, as tradition. Rebecca responded with documents, timelines, and my name printed again and again where it was supposed to be. Sitting in that courtroom watching my father realize he couldn't charm or intimidate his way out felt surreal, not satisfying, clarifying, because I saw him stripped of the role he'd always played. No longer the authority, just a man answering questions he never expected to be asked. Maisie asked me one night if we were in trouble, and I told her no. And for the first time, that answer wasn't aspirational, it was factual. As records came in, it became impossible to deny what had happened. Money moved where it shouldn't have. approvals signed without disclosure, benefits distributed unevenly under the guise of family support, and then the moment that truly broke something in me arrived, when Rebecca showed me my mother's signature, not once, but multiple times, authorizing decisions that excluded me. And I need you to hear this clearly. Betrayal from a parent hits differently when it's quiet, when it's procedural, when it's ink on paper instead of words shouted in anger, because it means it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice, repeated, justified, normalized. I didn't cry in her office. I felt something colder than grief. Acceptance. The kind that tells you the relationship you hoped for never existed. Court ended with numbers. Restitution, penalties, interest, my share restored plus costs. But winning didn't feel like victory. It felt like oxygen returning after years of shallow breathing. When the money finally hit my account months later, I didn't celebrate. I paid off debts, secured Maisie's future, and closed accounts that tied me to them. And then there was one last thread. The paternity question my father had used like a knife my whole life. A question he'd never bothered to answer because uncertainty gave him power. I didn't owe anyone proof, but I owed myself clarity, so I took the test, quietly, without ceremony, and when the results confirmed what I already knew, I felt rage instead of relief, because it meant the cruelty was never justified by doubt. It was enabled by cowardice. I sent the results once, without commentary, and blocked them all. Weeks later, my mother showed up alone, crying, confessing, explaining, asking to fix it now that the truth was comfortable, and I told her no. Because love that only activates after validation isn't love, it's control. Closing the door on her wasn't dramatic, it was necessary. And if you're still here listening to this, I need you to understand something. The hardest part of walking away isn't the loss, it's the clarity. Because once you see who someone is when they think no one is watching, you can't unknow it. And what comes next isn't quiet resolution, it's consequences, social ones, financial ones, reputational ones. And the people who benefited from your silence will scramble when it's gone. So stay with me. Because what happened after the court decision didn't just change my life. It collapsed theirs in ways they never anticipated. And the next turn in this story proves something people hate admitting. Sometimes the system works when you stop protecting the people who abuse it. After the court ruling, the world didn't explode the way movies promise. There were no gasps or applause or dramatic exits. It was quieter than that, heavier. Like when a building finally settles after a long tremor and everyone pretends they didn't feel it. My parents didn't call to apologize, they called to negotiate, because accountability to people like them is just another transaction. My mother left a voicemail talking about misunderstandings and healing, and how families work through things. My father sent nothing for days, and that silence told me more than any speech ever could. It meant he was recalculating, because men like him don't feel shame first, they feel risk. And once risk appears, they start inventorying what they can still control, what they can spin, who they can still influence. And that's when the consequences began to ripple outward in ways I never expected. Because here's the thing no one tells you about standing up to a family like mine. You don't just confront people. You disrupt a system that's been quietly rewarding bad behavior for years, and when that system gets exposed, everyone who benefited from it panics. The first crack showed up with Chelsea. She called screaming one afternoon about how I'd humiliated her. Our reputation was being destroyed, how people were asking questions she shouldn't have to answer. And I remember holding the phone away from my ear, listening to her spiral, and realizing something important. She wasn't upset that she'd been part of stealing from me. She was upset that it no longer worked, that the version of reality she'd lived in where she was special and protected had been punctured. She accused me of jealousy, of revenge, of trying to ruin her life, and I let her talk until she ran out of steam because there was nothing left to say. Defending yourself to someone who needs you to be the villain is just participation in their fantasy. And I was done auditioning for roles I didn't choose after that call. I blocked her too, not out of anger but out of clarity, because if you keep listening to people who refuse to hear you, they will convince you to doubt your own memory, and I didn't have room for that anymore, especially not with a child watching how I handled conflict. Maisie noticed the changes before I did. Kids always do. She started sleeping through the night again, stopped hovering near doors when we visited friends, stopped asking if she needed to be quieter or smaller or better to be welcome. One night, she said something that punched the air out of my lungs. She said, "I like our house better than Grandpa's because nobody yells." And that's when I understood the cost of the environment I'd been tolerating, not just for me but for her. Because silence in the face of cruelty doesn't stay contained. It leaks into the next generation like mold. My parents tried to apply pressure through extended family next. Aunts and uncles who'd always stayed conveniently neutral suddenly had opinions. Messages came in about forgiveness and moving on and not tearing the family apart over money. And I want to pause here and say something directly to you listening. If you've ever been told you're destroying a family by refusing to be mistreated, understand this. Families that rely on one person's silence to function are already broken. You're just the first one brave enough to stop pretending otherwise. When I pointed out that my daughter had been shoved to the floor and called unreal, most of them changed the subject because it was never about morality, it was about comfort, and my refusal made them uncomfortable, so they labeled me difficult instead. The money itself became almost irrelevant at that point. Yes, it secured Maisie's future. Yes, it paid off debts that had kept me anxious for years. But the real shift was psychological, because for the first time I wasn't living at the mercy of people who thought they owned me, and that freedom exposed something else I hadn't anticipated. How much of my identity had been shaped by surviving them. Without their constant criticism and chaos, my nervous system didn't know what to do at first. I'd flinch when the phone rang, brace myself at holidays, expect some new accusation to drop. And when it didn't, I felt oddly restless, like a soldier after war waiting for a noise that never comes. Therapy helped with that. My therapist explained that when you grow up in unpredictable environments, your brain learns to equate calm with danger, because calm never lasted. So part of healing is learning to tolerate peace without sabotaging it. And that hit me hard, because I realized how many times I'd kept toxic people around simply because their chaos felt familiar, predictable in its cruelty, but familiar all the same. My parents didn't take the loss quietly. My father started telling people he'd been manipulated, that lawyers had twisted things, that I'd been coached, anything to avoid the simple truth that his choices had consequences. And then something interesting happened. People started comparing stories. Cousins I barely knew reached out privately, asking careful questions, sharing small memories that suddenly made sense, comments he'd made, money that had gone missing, favoritism they'd always noticed but never named. And that's when the narrative really began to crumble, because abusers rely on isolation, on making each victim feel alone in their experience. But once people start talking, patterns emerge, and patterns are hard to dismiss. My mother tried a different tactic. She showed up unannounced one afternoon with baked goods and tears. As if sugar and vulnerability could erase decades of enabling, she said she just wanted to see Maisie, that she missed her. That family was everything. And I asked her one question that stopped her cold. I asked, "What have you done to make sure this never happens again?" She stared at me like I'd spoken another language, because she thought proximity was enough, that wanting access equaled accountability. And when she couldn't answer, I told her no, calmly, firmly, and closed the door. Setting boundaries with parents feels unnatural when you've been trained to obey them, but once you do it a few times, you realize how powerful it is to choose your own standards. My father's final move was the ugliest. He hinted publicly that maybe I wasn't his, that perhaps there had been secrets. He didn't say it outright at first, just enough for people to speculate, because he knew how destabilizing that doubt had been my entire life. And for a brief moment, I felt that old familiar wobble, that fear that maybe he could still hurt me. But then I remembered something crucial. Truth doesn't need theatrics, lies do. So I took the test, not for him, not for court, for me. And when the results came back confirming what I'd always known, the rage I felt surprised me, because it meant all those years of cruelty had been optional. He could have resolved his doubts privately, could have chosen decency, but instead he'd weaponized uncertainty to justify abuse, and that realization sealed something shut inside me. I sent him the results without commentary and blocked him everywhere. No explanation, no demand for apology, because some people don't deserve closure, they deserve consequences. And here's where the story turns in a way I didn't see coming, because once my parents lost control of the narrative and the finances, they lost something else too, their standing. The house they'd lorded over everyone for years became unsustainable under the court's restitution order. They sold it quietly, downsized, disappeared from social circles that had only tolerated them when money and influence flowed freely. People who once laughed at my father's jokes stopped returning his calls. My mother, who'd prided herself on hosting, suddenly wasn't invited anywhere, and I won't pretend I felt triumphant about that. Mostly I felt sad, because it confirmed something I'd suspected for a long time, that their relationships had been transactional too. built on image and advantage rather than genuine connection. Meanwhile, my life got smaller and richer at the same time. Our routine settled. Maisie flourished. I took a job opportunity I'd been too scared to consider before. We made new traditions that didn't involve walking on eggshells, and slowly the constant background hum of anxiety faded, replaced by something steadier. And I want to talk directly to you again here, because if you're still listening, it's probably because some part of this feels familiar. Maybe you haven't been shoved at a table or robbed through a trust, but you know what it's like to be minimized, to be told your feelings are too much, to be asked to keep the peace at your own expense, to be the reasonable one while everyone else behaves unreasonably. And I need you to hear this. Protecting yourself is not betrayal, it's survival. Choosing your child over your parents is not cruelty, it's responsibility, and refusing to participate in dysfunction doesn't make you dramatic, it makes you honest. The hardest part of this journey wasn't the court hearings or the confrontations, it was accepting that the family I wanted wasn't the family I had, and grieving something that never truly existed, because grief isn't always about losing what you had, sometimes it's about losing what you hoped for. But once that grief passes, something remarkable happens. You start building instead of enduring. You stop measuring your worth by how much pain you can absorb. You start teaching your children that love doesn't come with conditions, and belonging isn't something you earn by shrinking. And as my parents faded into the background of my life, I realized something else. They weren't the main characters anymore, not in my story, not in Maisie's. They became a chapter, a cautionary one. And what comes next is about rebuilding, about what happens when the dust settles and you're left with the freedom to choose differently. So stay with me, because the next turn isn't about revenge or loss. It's about the unexpected ways life expands when you finally stop asking permission to exist. When the noise finally died down and the legal dust settled, something unexpected happened. I had space, real space, not just the physical kind, but mental space where thoughts could exist without immediately bracing for impact. And that's when the second wave hit, the one nobody warns you about. The reckoning that comes after you win, because winning doesn't end the story, it exposes everything that was buried under survival. And suddenly, I wasn't just a daughter who'd been wronged, or a mother who'd protected her child. I was a person standing in the quiet asking a terrifying question. Who am I when I'm no longer reacting to them? Because for most of my life, my identity had been built in opposition to my parents. Don't upset them. Don't embarrass them. Don't provoke them. Don't need too much. And when those rules disappeared, I felt untethered, like someone had taken away the gravity I'd been orbiting. My days got calmer, but my nights got louder. Old memories surfaced, moments I'd minimized because acknowledging them would've meant admitting how bad it really was. I started remembering the little things, the birthdays where my gifts were practical while Chelsea's were celebratory, the school events where my accomplishments were footnotes, the way my father's jokes always landed on me when the room needed a laugh at someone else's expense, and I realized how often I'd rewritten those moments in my own head to make them hurt less. Because that's what children do to survive parents who won't change. They turn cruelty into coincidence, favoritism into misunderstanding, neglect into independence. And when you stop doing that, the truth hits harder than the original wound. Therapy peeled those layers back slowly, not with grand revelations but with uncomfortable clarity. My therapist once said something that lodged itself in my chest and refused to leave. She said, "You weren't strong because you endured it. You were strong because you adapted." But adaptation isn't the same as healing, and that distinction mattered because I'd worn my resilience like armor for so long that I hadn't realized how heavy it was. Letting it down felt like vulnerability, and vulnerability felt dangerous, especially with a child depending on me. Maisie noticed the changes before anyone else. She started asking questions, not about her grandparents specifically, but about fairness, about why some people get treated better, about whether grown-ups are always right, and those conversations mattered more than any courtroom victory because they were chances to break a cycle, to answer honestly without poisoning her with bitterness. I told her that sometimes people are wrong even when they're older, that love shouldn't hurt, that being family doesn't give anyone permission to be unkind, and watching her absorb those ideas with the seriousness only children have made me realize how close I'd come to teaching her the opposite just by staying silent. The ripple effects kept spreading. Acquaintances who'd heard fragments of the story reached out quietly. Coworkers shared their own family struggles in hushed tones like we were confessing secrets in a church basement. One woman told me she'd gone no contact with her mother after watching how I handled mine. Another said she finally understood why she felt dread before every holiday, and that's when it clicked that this wasn't just my story anymore. It was a mirror for a lot of people who'd been told their pain didn't count because it came from family. My parents tried one last coordinated effort to regain control. They sent a letter, not handwritten, typed, formal, full of words like reconciliation and moving forward and misunderstandings on both sides. Reading it felt like déjà vu, the same language they'd always used to blur accountability, to imply mutual fault where none existed. But this time I saw it clearly. Reconciliation without responsibility is just another form of manipulation, so I didn't respond, and that silence was harder for them than any argument would have been, because it denied them the drama they needed to reassert dominance. Chelsea's situation unraveled more publicly than mine ever had. The financial fallout forced her to downsize. Friends who'd orbited her privilege drifted away, and without the family narrative protecting her, she struggled to explain why she'd been complicit. I didn't celebrate that either. I felt something closer to grim acceptance, because watching someone face consequences doesn't erase the damage they did. It just balances the scales slightly. My focus stayed where it belonged, on building something better. We moved, explained that money didn't make us happy, but stability did. Maisie got her own room for the first time, decorated it with posters and drawings taped crookedly to the walls, and one night as I tucked her in, she said something so simple it nearly broke me. She said, "I like our life now because it feels quiet inside." And that was the moment I knew I'd made the right choice, because children don't measure success in money or status. They measure it in safety, and for the first time her nervous system wasn't on high alert. Holidays came and went without tension. We made our own traditions, pancakes on Christmas morning, movie nights, volunteering together, small rituals that didn't revolve around appeasing anyone. And with each passing month, my parents' voices in my head grew quieter, replaced by my own, stronger and more certain. I started trusting my instincts again, stopped second-guessing every decision, stopped assuming I was wrong by default. That shift affected every part of my life. Work opportunities I'd once dismissed as unrealistic suddenly felt possible. Friendships deepened when I stopped performing for approval, and dating became something I approached with boundaries instead of fear. But the most profound change was internal. I stopped seeing myself as someone who'd escaped something terrible and started seeing myself as someone who'd chosen something better. And that difference matters, because escape is reactive. Choice is intentional, and intention is where power lives. I want to pause here and talk directly to you again, because if you're still listening, it's not just for the drama. It's because some part of you recognizes this transition, the moment after the explosion when you're standing in the aftermath wondering who you are now. And I need you to know that confusion is normal, that grief and relief can coexist, that missing people who hurt you doesn't mean you should go back. It just means you're human. And if you've ever been told that cutting off family makes you cold or selfish or ungrateful, let me reframe that for you. Boundaries don't make you cruel. They make you clear. They draw a line around what you're willing to tolerate. And clarity is kindness to yourself and to your children, because it models something they'll carry for life. My parents still exist somewhere out there, living a smaller, quieter version of the life they once controlled. And sometimes I wonder if they understand what they lost, not the money, not the house, but access to the people who could have loved them freely if they'd chosen decency. But that's not my question to answer anymore. My responsibility ends where their accountability begins. And as peaceful as my life has become, there's still one unresolved thread, one moment that hasn't fully surfaced yet, something that happened quietly after everything else, a choice I made that I haven't talked about because it changes the meaning of the entire story. And that's where we're headed next, because rebuilding isn't just about what you walk away from, it's about what you consciously decide to carry forward. And the next step I took wasn't obvious, it wasn't dramatic, but it altered the trajectory of our lives in a way I never expected. So stay with me, because the calm you see now was earned through one final, deeply personal decision that forced me to confront the last piece of their control I hadn't even realized I was still holding. The decision I didn't expect to make came quietly on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing dramatic was happening, and that's how I know it was real, because the biggest shifts in my life have never come with fireworks. They've come when I finally stopped running on adrenaline and started listening to the parts of myself that had been drowned out for years. I was sitting at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out in front of me. Not legal documents this time, but ordinary ones, school forms, budget notes, Reminders scribbled on the back of an envelope, the kind of mundane clutter that means you're building a life instead of defending one. And in the middle of all that normalcy, I found myself staring at my phone, hovering over a contact I hadn't touched since the fallout. My father's number was gone. My mother's too. Chelsea's erased without ceremony, but there was another name there. My grandfather's old attorney. The man who'd handled his affairs before everything got twisted. I hadn't planned to call him. I didn't need anything from him legally anymore. The court had settled that, but something kept tugging at me, a sense that there was one last truth I needed to face before I could fully close that chapter. Because winning a case doesn't automatically give you peace. Sometimes peace requires understanding what was taken from you in ways that money can't replace. I dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it, half expecting voicemail, but he answered, his voice older than I remembered, steadier, and when I explained who I was, there was a pause. Not confusion, recognition. He said my name like he'd been waiting for me to say it, and that pause told me more than words ever could. We talked for a while, not about money but about my grandfather, about the man he'd been before age softened his edges, about how he'd spoken of me, not often but deliberately, as if making a point. The attorney told me something that landed heavier than any accusation or verdict, he said. My grandfather had worried about me, not in the abstract way people worry about family members, but specifically about how I was treated, about how I always seemed to be the one accommodating everyone else. He tried to talk to my father about it once and been shut down, brushed off, dismissed, and that conversation had stuck with him. He'd made decisions afterward, quiet ones, intentional ones. And when I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking, not with anger but with grief, because I realized I'd spent so much time believing I was invisible that I'd missed the fact that someone had seen me all along. That knowledge changed the texture of my anger, softened it into something more complex, because it meant the story wasn't just about betrayal, it was also about loss. The loss of a relationship that could have been different if courage had arrived sooner. I didn't tell Maisie about the call right away. Some truths need to be digested before they're shared, but it influenced how I approached everything after. I stopped framing my parents as villains in my own head and started seeing them as people who'd chosen fear over decency again and again. That shift didn't excuse them, but it freed me from needing them to understand what they'd done, because clarity doesn't require validation from the people who caused the harm. It requires honesty with yourself. Maisie sensed the shift even if she didn't know the details. She started asking about her great-grandfather, about family history in a way that felt curious rather than anxious. And I told her stories that didn't revolve around pain, stories about resilience, about standing up quietly, about leaving something better behind, because children don't need the full weight of adult betrayal, they need models of integrity, and that's when I made another decision that surprised even me. I reached out to my grandfather's side of the family, relatives I'd been kept distant from by design, people my parents had subtly discouraged connections with. And the response was cautious at first, tentative messages, careful invitations, but slowly bridges formed, not dramatic reconciliations, just conversations that felt honest, unguarded. And in those exchanges, I saw a version of family that wasn't transactional, that didn't require me to perform or prove my worth. And that contrast highlighted just how warped my baseline had been. Rebuilding my sense of belonging took time. It wasn't something I could rush or force. Trust grows slowly when it's been broken repeatedly, but each positive interaction rewired something inside me, teaching my nervous system that connection didn't have to come with strings attached. My parents tried one last indirect move around this time. A mutual acquaintance mentioned casually that they were worried about me, that I seemed isolated, that cutting off family was unhealthy, and I remember smiling when I heard that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Concern weaponized into control, the implication that independence equaled instability, and I realized then how deeply they relied on other people to enforce their narrative, to pressure me back into line without having to confront me directly. But that tactic lost its power once I stopped caring about their version of events, because the truth doesn't need a spokesperson when your life reflects it. My days became fuller in small, meaningful ways, volunteering at Maisie's school, taking classes I'd always postponed, allowing myself to want things without justifying them, and the more grounded I became, the clearer it was how much energy I'd spent managing other people's emotions at the expense of my own. That realization brought anger back for a moment. Not explosive anger, but focused anger, the kind that fuels boundaries rather than arguments. I wrote letters I never sent, said things out loud when I was alone, not to rehearse confrontations, but to release thoughts that had been bottled up for decades, because unexpressed emotion doesn't disappear, it turns inward, and I was done punishing myself for other people's failures. The last time I heard about my parents was through a distant relative who mentioned they'd moved again, downsizing further, cutting back. The tone wasn't malicious, just factual, and I felt nothing but a quiet sense of distance, like hearing about characters from a book you finished reading, and that neutrality was the clearest sign of healing I'd experienced yet, because love and hate are both attachments. Indifference is freedom, but freedom doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without bleeding, and that's where I stand now, not triumphant, not bitter, just grounded, aware of the cost of the choices I made and confident they were necessary. And I want to speak directly to you one more time here, because if you've followed this far, you're probably asking yourself what all of this means for your own life, whether walking away is possible, whether standing up will cost you everything, and the truth is it might cost you the illusion you've been surviving on, but it will give you something far more valuable in return, a life that doesn't require constant self-betrayal, a future where your children learn self-respect by watching you practice it, and a sense of peace that comes from knowing you didn't stay silent when it mattered most. But this isn't the end of the story, because the final shift didn't come from cutting them off, or winning in court, or even reclaiming what was stolen. It came from a moment so small most people would miss it. A moment when Maisie said something that reframed everything I thought this fight had been about. And that moment changed how I see legacy, love, and what it actually means to protect what really matters. So stay with me, because the next turn isn't about them at all. It's about the quiet payoff that makes every hard choice worth it. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with a confrontation or a phone call or some dramatic knock at the door. It arrived on an ordinary morning when I was half awake and pouring cereal into a bowl that cracked along the rim because I'd been gripping it too hard without realizing it. Maisie was at the table humming to herself, swinging her legs. Safe in that way kids are when they finally believe the ground under them isn't going to shift without warning. And she looked up at me and said something so simple and so devastatingly clear that it cut straight through years of noise. She said, "Mom, I don't feel weird anymore." And I froze because that sentence carried more weight than every legal document, every argument, every victory I'd fought for up to that point. I asked her what she meant, expecting something small, a school thing, a friend thing, but she shrugged and said, "Like when we go places. I don't feel like I have to be extra good so people won't get mad." And that was it. That was the moment the entire story rearranged itself in my head, because I realized that everything I thought I was doing for myself had actually been about her, about breaking a cycle so deeply embedded that I'd mistaken it for personality. I'd spent my life believing love was conditional, that belonging was something you earned by shrinking, by accommodating, by never making things uncomfortable for the people who held power over you, and without ever saying it out loud, I'd been teaching my daughter the same rules just by surviving them, and the idea that she had absorbed even a fraction of that broke something open in me that hadn't fully healed yet, because winning against my parents didn't automatically erase the lessons they'd stamped into me. It just gave me room to see them clearly, and clarity brings responsibility, the responsibility to choose differently on purpose, not just reactively. I sat down across from her and told her she never had to be extra good to deserve space, that her feelings weren't inconveniences, that adults who require children to manage their emotions are not safe adults. And as I said it, I realized I was speaking to my younger self too, undoing scripts that had run unchecked for decades. This is the part people don't talk about when they glorify cutting toxic people off. The aftermath, where you have to rewire yourself, where the silence left behind isn't peaceful at first but disorienting, because chaos had become familiar. Predictable even, and peace feels suspicious when you're not used to it. There were days I caught myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for a guilt message, a crisis, some manufactured emergency that would force me back into the role of fixer, and when it didn't come, my body didn't relax, it tensed, like it was bracing for impact that never arrived. Healing is uncomfortable like that. It strips away coping mechanisms you didn't even realize were coping mechanisms until they're gone, and it leaves you alone with yourself in a way that's both terrifying and freeing. I started noticing how often I apologized out of habit, how quickly I explained myself even when no explanation was owed, how deeply ingrained the fear of being misunderstood was. Because in my family, misunderstanding had been used as punishment. They'd twist words, intentions, entire realities until defending yourself felt pointless. And stepping out of that environment didn't magically undo the reflexes it created. So, I worked on them consciously, painfully, correcting myself in real time, letting silence sit where excuses used to live, and slowly the world didn't end, people didn't abandon me, boundaries didn't cause explosions, which was shocking in itself, because I'd been taught that asserting myself would lead to catastrophe, that the only reason things functioned at all was because I kept the peace at my own expense. And watching that belief crumble was both exhilarating and enraging because it meant I'd been sacrificing myself for nothing. Maisie started thriving in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. She spoke up more, laughed louder, stopped scanning rooms for approval before acting, and every one of those changes was a quiet indictment of the environment she'd been exposed to before, because children are honest reflections of the emotional climate they live in, and hers was finally safe enough to allow growth. There was one afternoon in particular, when this became impossible to ignore. We were at a birthday party for one of her classmates, nothing fancy, just a park, cake, parents pretending to enjoy small talk, and another child shoved Maisie during a game, not maliciously, just carelessly, and I watched her pause, straighten herself, and say clearly, "Don't push me." No tears, no hesitation, no looking to an adult to fix it for her. The other child apologized, and the game continued. And I had to turn away for a second because the pride and grief hit me at the same time. Pride in her confidence, grief for the years I didn't have that voice. And in that moment, I understood something crucial. Protecting your child doesn't always look like shielding them from harm. Sometimes it looks like teaching them they're allowed to respond to it, that their boundaries matter even when the person crossing them doesn't intend harm. That lesson alone was worth every fallout, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, and it cemented my resolve in a way no courtroom ever could, because this wasn't about money or justice or even revenge anymore. It was about legacy, about what gets passed down quietly through behavior and beliefs, and I was determined that fear would not be one of the things my daughter inherited from me. My parents tried one last maneuver around this time, not directly because they knew better now, but through extended family, through whispers and concerned check-ins that were anything but questions framed as worry, but laced with judgment. Is Leah okay? She seems angry. Kids need grandparents. And it was almost impressive how consistent the narrative was, as if they'd all received the same memo, and for the first time I saw it for what it was, an attempt to regain control by social pressure, by making me the problem for refusing to play along. And that's when another shift happened inside me. Because instead of feeling defensive or tempted to explain, I felt detached, like I was watching a play I'd seen too many times to be emotionally invested in. I realized that people who benefit from your silence will always frame your voice as aggression, and that realization stripped their words of power. I responded politely when necessary, briefly when not, and refused to engage in debates about my choices, because I'd learned that justification is an invitation for negotiation, and my boundaries were not up for negotiation. The more I held that line, the quieter the noise became, not because they understood, but because they got bored. Drama requires participation, and I'd finally stopped supplying it. There's a particular loneliness that comes with this stage, the kind that doesn't come from isolation but from differentiation, when you realize you're no longer operating under the same rules as the people you came from, and that gap can feel vast, but it's also where growth lives. I filled that space intentionally, building routines that grounded me, friendships that felt reciprocal, traditions with Maisie that were ours alone, small rituals that reinforced safety and connection. And in doing so, I noticed something else changing. My internal dialogue softened, the constant self-monitoring eased, the hypervigilance relaxed, because my nervous system was finally learning that conflict wasn't inevitable, that peace wasn't a trap, that stability could exist without vigilance. This didn't happen all at once. There were setbacks, moments when an old trigger would catch me off guard and I'd feel that familiar spike of anxiety, but now I recognized it for what it was, a conditioned response, not a present threat, and that awareness gave me choice. I could pause, breathe, respond instead of react. And each time I did, I reclaimed a little more of myself. Maisie noticed these changes too, kids always do. She commented one night while we were reading together that I didn't sigh as much anymore. And I laughed because she was right. I'd spent years exhaling tension I didn't even know I was holding. And now there was less to release, less to carry. That's when I understood the true cost of staying silent for so long. It wasn't just the overt harm. It was the cumulative erosion of self, the way constant invalidation teaches you to doubt your own perceptions, your right to respond, your worth. Undoing that damage takes time and intention, but it's possible. And it's necessary if you want a different future than the past you were handed. I want to say something directly to you here, because if you're still listening, there's a reason. Maybe you recognized yourself in the shrinking, in the obligation, in the fear of being seen as difficult for setting boundaries. Maybe you've been told family loyalty requires self-sacrifice, that peace is maintained by endurance, that love means tolerating harm, and I need you to hear this clearly. Loyalty that costs you your dignity is not loyalty. It's compliance, and love that demands your silence is not. Love, it's control. You are allowed to protect yourself and your children even when the threat comes from the people who are supposed to care for you most. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you responsible, and responsibility is what actually breaks cycles. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not endless understanding for people who refuse to change. Responsibility to yourself and to the next generation. And that brings me to the next turn in this story, because just when I thought the dust had settled and the lessons were clear, something unexpected happened that forced me to confront one final question I'd been avoiding. Not about my parents, not about money, but about what accountability really looks like when you're no longer fighting back but moving forward. And that moment didn't test my anger or my resolve. It tested my integrity in a way I hadn't anticipated. And what I chose to do next reshaped the meaning of everything that came before it. So stay with me, because the next shift isn't loud or dramatic, but it's the one that determines whether the story ends in survival or transformation. The hardest part of moving forward wasn't cutting them off or winning in court or even protecting my daughter in the moment everyone saw. It was the quiet weeks afterward when nothing dramatic happened, and I had to sit with the truth that I'd been trained to measure my worth by how much pain I could absorb without making anyone else uncomfortable. Because when the noise dies down, that's when old programming gets loud. That's when you start questioning whether you overreacted, whether you misunderstood, whether you should soften things to make them easier for other people to digest. And I caught myself doing it more than once, replaying the Christmas scene in my head, wondering if I should have handled it differently, if there was a version of events where I could have protected Maisie without detonating the family. And every time that thought surfaced, I forced myself to go back to the image that mattered most. My daughter on the floor, looking up at me, waiting to see what kind of adult I was going to be in that moment, because clarity lives there, not in hypotheticals, not in guilt, not in other people's comfort. Clarity lives in the split second where a child learns whether the world is safe or arbitrary, whether the adults in charge will step in or look away. And I chose that moment deliberately, even though it cost me relationships I'd been clinging to out of habit more than love. The aftermath wasn't clean. It never is. There were social consequences, whispered judgments, invitations that quietly stopped coming, relatives who took sides without asking questions, and at first that stung because rejection always does. But then something unexpected happened. The space they left behind didn't fill with loneliness. It filled with relief, with calm, with an absence of dread I hadn't realized was missing. I stopped bracing myself before every holiday, stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped scanning faces for signs of disapproval. And that freedom was intoxicating in a grounded way, not the rush of chaos I'd mistaken for connection before, but the steady comfort of not being on edge. Maisie noticed it too, kids always do. She stopped asking whether we were going to see certain people, stopped asking what she should say or how she should act. She just showed up as herself, and watching that happen made something very clear to me. Boundaries don't just protect you from others, they protect you from becoming a version of yourself you don't want to model. I started thinking a lot about the word family and how easily it's used to excuse behavior we wouldn't tolerate from anyone else, how loyalty is framed as obligation instead of choice, how forgiveness is demanded without accountability, and how often children are expected to adapt to adults instead of the other way around. These realizations didn't come all at once. They unfolded through small moments, like the first Christmas we spent alone, just the two of us, where I expected sadness and instead felt peace. We made pancakes for dinner, watched movies in pajamas, laughed without walking on eggshells, and when Maisie asked why we weren't going to Grandpa's, I told her the truth in a way a 9-year-old can hold. I said sometimes adults make choices that aren't safe, and when that happens it's our job to keep ourselves safe even if other people don't like it. She nodded like that made perfect sense, because to a child raised with consistency it does. It's only Confusing when you're taught that love and harm coexist. I won't pretend I didn't grieve the idea of the parents I wished I had. Grief doesn't require contact. It requires honesty, and I let myself mourn the fantasy while releasing the reality. There's a difference. One keeps you stuck and the other sets you free. I also had to confront my own complicity, not in the abuse, but in the silence that allowed it to continue longer than it should have. That part was uncomfortable. Owning the ways I'd minimized, rationalized, endured, because acknowledging that doesn't mean blaming yourself. It means reclaiming agency. It means saying I didn't have the tools then, but I do now, and I will use them. Accountability isn't just something we demand from others. It's something we practice internally, and that practice changed how I showed up everywhere, at work, in friendships, even in how I spoke to myself. I stopped over-explaining, stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped chasing approval from people who thrived on withholding it, and the more I did that, the clearer the pattern became. The people who respected boundaries leaned in, the people who didn't fell away, and that sorting felt less like loss and more like alignment. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a moment arrived that crystallized everything. Maisie came home from school upset because a classmate had said something unkind. Nothing dramatic, just one of those small social wounds kids collect as they grow. And she told me about it without fear, without shame, without minimizing her feelings. She trusted that I would listen and take her seriously, and that trust was the real victory, not court orders or apologies that never came. Trust is built in moments like that, and it told me I was doing something right, that the environment I was creating was healing rather than confusing, that she didn't have to perform to be protected, and that realization reframed the entire journey. This wasn't about punishing my parents or proving a point. It was about building something better in the space they left behind. Something intentional, something stable, something that didn't require anyone to be smaller to keep the peace. I want to pause here and talk to you directly because stories like this tend to split people into camps. Those who say blood is blood, no matter what, and those who understand that harm doesn't become holy because it comes from family. If you're listening and feeling conflicted, if part of you is angry on my behalf and part of you is uncomfortable with how far it went, I want you to sit with that discomfort for a second. Ask yourself who benefits when boundaries are framed as cruelty, who is protected when silence is praised as maturity, and who is harmed when children are taught to tolerate disrespect from the people closest to them. These aren't abstract questions. They play out in real lives, real bodies, real nervous systems, and the answers matter. I'd love to know what you think here, because this is where the conversation gets interesting. Do you believe family loyalty has limits? And if so, where do you draw that line? Drop in the comments, because these stories don't exist in a vacuum, and I know I'm not the only one who's lived some version of this. As for us, life kept moving forward in its quiet, determined way. Routines settled, laughter returned, tension faded, and one afternoon, as we were walking home from the park, Maisie reached for my hand and said something so casually it almost slipped past me. She said, "I like our life." And that sentence landed with a finality that felt like closure. Not the kind you get from confrontation, but the kind you earn through consistency, through showing up again and again without conditions, through choosing safety over familiarity. And that's when I understood that the real reckoning wasn't with my parents at all. It was with the beliefs they handed me, beliefs about worth, about endurance, about what love is supposed to look like. And by dismantling those beliefs piece by piece, I wasn't just ending a chapter, I was changing the trajectory of the story. And yet, even as things stabilized, there was one last ripple I didn't see coming, a consequence that forced me to decide how I would carry this experience forward into the wider world, whether I would keep it contained or use it as a lens through which to act when I saw similar patterns elsewhere. And that decision led to an encounter that challenged me in a completely different way, one that tested whether the lessons I'd learned were truly integrated or just situational. And that's where this goes next, because growth doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It shows up disguised as a choice you can't ignore, and the way you respond to that choice tells you who you've become. So stay with me, because the next turn isn't about my parents or the past. It's about what happens when you recognize harm in real time and decide whether to step in or stay silent. And that decision has consequences far beyond one family. The moment that forced me to decide whether I was truly changed or just reacting came on a random Tuesday afternoon in a place that should have been harmless, the school pickup line, that slow-moving parade of cars and distracted parents where nothing big is supposed to happen. I was sitting there scrolling absently, waiting for Maisie to come out. when I noticed a woman a few cars ahead leaning out of her window snapping at a little boy who couldn't have been older than 7, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Hurry up, you're always so slow. What is wrong with you?" And the boy shrank in on himself in a way I recognized instantly, shoulders curled, eyes down, moving faster not because it helped but because fear told him speed might make the criticism stop, and something in my chest tightened because I knew that posture. I'd worn it my entire childhood. I'd taught myself to disappear into it, and for a split second I felt that old reflex surge up, the instinct to mind my business, to avoid making waves, to tell myself it wasn't my place, that I didn't know the full story, that parents get stressed, that intervening would only make things worse. All the familiar excuses lined up neatly like soldiers. And then I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Maisie's face watching the scene with that careful alertness kids develop when they sense emotional danger, and I realized this was the test, not a courtroom, not a family dinner, but a small, everyday moment where silence teaches as much as action. I could feel my heart pounding because stepping in meant risking confrontation, risking being labeled dramatic or intrusive, risking the very judgments I'd spent my life trying to avoid, but not stepping in meant reinforcing the idea that adults are allowed to be cruel and everyone else is supposed to tolerate it. And I couldn't do that anymore, not with my daughter watching. So I put the car in park, stepped out, and walked toward the woman, my voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," I said. "There's no need to talk to him like that." The woman snapped her head toward me, eyes flashing with surprise and indignation. "Who asked you?" She shot back, and in that instant I felt the old fear flare, the one that says back down now. This is getting uncomfortable, but I stayed where I was. "I'm asking you to lower your voice," I said. "He's a child," and something interesting happened. Other parents started paying attention. Heads turned, eyes focused, the social dynamic shifted. The woman looked around, realized she was no longer operating in private, and her tone changed, defensive now instead of aggressive. "Mind your own business," she muttered, and turned back toward her car. The boy climbed in silently, eyes wide, and I walked back to my car shaking slightly, not from fear exactly but from adrenaline. Maisie climbed in a moment later, and before I could say anything she asked, "Why did you do that?" And I told her the truth, because sometimes adults forget they're being watched, and sometimes kids need to see that it's okay to speak up. She nodded thoughtfully, and that was that, but inside me something settled into place, because that moment proved the change was real, not just situational, not just about my parents, but about the values I was choosing to live by, the kind of adult I was becoming, the kind of example I was setting. And as we drove home, I thought about how many times I'd witnessed moments like that growing up and stayed silent. How many times my silence had been mistaken for agreement, and how heavy that realization felt now that I could see it clearly. Growth has a way of making your past choices uncomfortable, not to punish you but to show you how far you've come, and I sat with that discomfort instead of pushing it away. Later that week another unexpected message arrived. Not from family this time, but from a distant cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd heard what happened. Fragments of the story filtered through the grapevine, and she wanted to tell me something. She wrote that she'd always admired how I kept things together, how calm I seemed, how she wished she could handle her family the way I did, and reading that stopped me cold because it exposed another layer of the illusion. People had mistaken my endurance for strength, my silence for resilience, and it made me wonder how many others were carrying the same burden, believing that suffering quietly was the price of belonging. I replied honestly, told her that what she saw wasn't strength, it was conditioning, and that it nearly cost me my daughter's sense of safety, and she wrote back a long message about her own experiences, about things she'd never said out loud. And that exchange turned into a series of conversations that reminded me how widespread these patterns are, how often they hide behind respectability and tradition, and how powerful it can be to name them. Not dramatically, not publicly, but truthfully, the ripple effects of one boundary began to reach places I hadn't anticipated. Friends opened up, colleagues shared stories, people I barely knew confided in me because something about my refusal to minimize had given them permission to examine their own lives. And while that was humbling, it was also sobering, because it meant responsibility doesn't end when you protect yourself. It expands, not in a way that requires you to fix everyone, but in a way that asks you to be honest about what you see and how you respond. Maisie continued to grow into herself in quiet, confident ways. She started advocating for classmates, correcting teachers respectfully when something felt unfair. asking thoughtful questions about why people act the way they do, and each of those moments felt like a small miracle, evidence that the cycle really was breaking, not perfectly, not without effort, but decisively. One night, as we were doing dishes together, she asked me if people can change, and I told her yes, but only when they want to, and only when they're willing to take responsibility for their actions. She considered that and then asked if Grandpa wanted to change, and I answered honestly again, I don't know. But I know it's not our job to wait for him to decide, and that seemed to satisfy her. Because children understand fairness instinctively when it's explained without manipulation. As time passed, the story stopped feeling raw and started feeling instructive. Not in a preachy way, but in a grounded one. I could see the through line clearly now, how small compromises accumulate, how silence becomes a habit, how habits become identities, and how breaking that chain requires a moment of courage that often feels disproportionate to the situation, but is actually about everything that came before it. I want to pause here and ask you something, because this is where the story intersects with your life, not mine. How many moments have you swallowed because you didn't want to be seen as difficult? How many times have you watched something feel wrong and told yourself it wasn't your place? And what has that silence cost you or the people watching you? Think about that and share it in the comments if you're willing, because these conversations matter more than polite agreement ever did. And as for what comes next, there was one final encounter, one unexpected confrontation that tied together all these threads in a way I didn't see coming. A moment that forced my parents' influence back into the present in a form I couldn't ignore, and it tested whether the boundaries I'd built were strong enough to hold under pressure, not from anger or guilt, but from something far more subtle. And that's where this story heads next, because closure isn't a single event, it's a series of choices, and the last choice I had to make was the hardest one of all. The final test didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors or lawyers on the line. It came disguised as something softer, something that used to trap me every time, a request wrapped in nostalgia and concern. It happened on a Sunday evening when the apartment was quiet and Maisie was coloring at the kitchen table, humming to herself. The kind of peaceful moment I used to believe was fragile and easily ruined. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, and for a split second, I almost ignored it. But instinct told me to look. The message was short and carefully worded. It said, "This is your father. I'm using a different phone. Your mother isn't well. She's been asking for you." And there it was, the old hook baited perfectly. Not anger, not accusation, but obligation mixed with worry. The kind that makes you feel cruel for hesitating. I stared at the screen longer than I wanted to admit, because even after everything, some part of me still responded to the idea of being needed, still wanted to be the one who fixed things, and that scared me more than the message itself. Maisie looked up and asked who it was, and I told her the truth, Grandpa. She went quiet, not frightened, just observant, and that alone told me how much had changed, because she wasn't bracing herself. She was waiting to see how I would handle it. The old me would have stepped into another room, lowered my voice, protected her from the tension while absorbing it myself. The new me stayed right there at the table and said out loud, "He wants me to call him back." She nodded slowly and asked, "Do you want to?" And that question landed heavier than any guilt trip ever had, because it centered my agency instead of their need. I realized in that moment that the hardest part of healing isn't cutting people off. It's learning to trust yourself when they try to come back in through a different door. I told her I didn't know yet, and that honesty felt cleaner than false certainty. After she went to bed, I sat on the couch holding my phone, replaying memories not as they happened but as I'd understood them then, and then replaying them again with clarity, seeing the patterns, the rehearsed concern, the selective vulnerability, the way emergencies always appeared when I started to feel stable. And I recognized the strategy for what it was, not necessarily malicious, but manipulative all the same, the kind that prioritizes relief over repair. I typed a response slowly, choosing each word like it mattered because it did. I said, "I'm sorry she's unwell. I hope she's getting care. I'm not able to be involved right now. Please don't contact me again." I read it 3 times before sending. My hands were steady. My chest was tight but not collapsing. And when the message delivered, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad in a deep, quiet way, because boundaries don't erase grief. They just stop it from running your life. The reply came faster than I expected, anger stripped of its softness. "So this is how you repay us after everything we've done for you." And there it was, The ledger, the scorekeeping, the rewriting of history. I didn't respond, I blocked the number, and I sat there letting the feelings move through me instead of chasing them away. Grief, relief, anger, compassion. All of it overlapping without canceling each other out. The next morning I woke up lighter, not because it was over, but because I hadn't betrayed myself. Maisie sensed it immediately, kids always do. She asked if I was okay, and I told her yes, and meant it. Weeks passed without incident. No surprise messages, no third-party guilt delivery, just quiet. And in that quiet I noticed how much energy I used to spend anticipating their moods, preparing defenses, rehearsing explanations that were never accepted. All that space opened up, and I filled it slowly with things that mattered: routines, friendships, patience, the ordinary work of building a life that doesn't revolve around someone else's approval. Then one afternoon a letter arrived. Handwritten, my mother's script unmistakable. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and finished what I was doing, noticing how different that felt from the past when I would have dropped everything. Curiosity and dread tangled together. When I did open it, the words were apologetic but vague. Regret without responsibility, pain without accountability. She wrote about missing Maisie, about family being everything, about mistakes made out of fear. And for the first time I read it without scanning for the part where I was supposed to respond. I saw it for what it was, an attempt to relieve her discomfort without addressing the harm. And I understood something important. Closure doesn't require consensus, it requires clarity. I didn't write back. I recycled the letter, and I felt a surprising amount of peace about it because silence was no longer my default, it was my choice. Time continued to do what it does best. It revealed outcomes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. I heard through the same distant channels that once carried gossip that my parents were struggling financially and socially. The story they told about me wasn't holding up as well without my participation, and that wasn't satisfying so much as instructive, because it proved that their narrative depended on my silence and proximity. Without it, the cracks were visible. Maisie thrived, not in some movie montage way, but in small, consistent ways. She laughed easily. She slept deeply. She spoke up when something felt wrong, and she trusted that I would listen. That trust was the real inheritance, more valuable than anything I could have reclaimed. One evening she asked me if I was ever scared, and I told her yes. But that being scared didn't mean you stop doing what's right. It means you check your reasons and move carefully anyway. She seemed satisfied with that, and I realized how different her childhood would be simply because fear wasn't running the household. As for me, I stopped trying to make sense of their choices and started focusing on my own. Therapy helped, not by rewriting the past, but by anchoring me in the present, by teaching me that compassion doesn't require access and forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. I learned to recognize guilt as a signal rather than a command, to sit with discomfort without rushing to resolve it for someone else's benefit. The final moment of this chapter didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived quietly on a holiday that used to be a battlefield. We spent it at home, just the two of us. Pancakes for dinner, music playing, laughter filling the space that used to hold tension. And I realized I wasn't missing anything. I wasn't waiting for a call. I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I was present fully, and that was the victory. Not revenge, not validation, but freedom. Freedom from the need to be understood by people who never tried to understand me. Freedom from the role I was assigned without consent. Freedom to model something better for my daughter. If you've stayed with me this far, I want you to hear this clearly. Walking away isn't weakness. It's discernment. Choosing peace over proximity isn't cruelty, it's maturity. And protecting your child or your inner child from harm isn't dramatic. It's responsible. I don't know where you're watching from or what time it is for you right now, but I know there's a reason this story found you. Maybe you're standing at the edge of a boundary you're afraid to set. Maybe you've already set it, and you're wondering if the quiet that followed means you did the wrong thing. Let me tell you, peace can feel unfamiliar when chaos was normal. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It means you're healing, and if you're wrestling with that, say so in the comments, because you're not alone and your story matters too. This isn't the end, it's a beginning, and there are more stories ahead about rebuilding, about identity, about what happens when you stop negotiating your worth. So stay with me, because the next chapter isn't about what they did, it's about what we do after we finally choose ourselves.